I was the one who left. People forget that part. They build the story around Marcus, around his quiet decency, around the way he carried boxes out of our apartment without raising his voice, while I stood in the doorway, holding a suitcase, already packed for a flight to Denver. They don't tell the part where I had been leaving for 6 months before I said the word. They don't mention the job offer I pursued without telling him, the lease I signed in Colorado before our marriage counselor had even scheduled the 3rd session. I was precise in my departure. Clinical. I had spreadsheets. So when I tell you that I drove 11 hours back to a family that never wanted me, to a man I'd gutted without ceremony, to a property in the Shenandoah Valley I swore I would never see again, I need you to understand the specific architecture of that humiliation. I didn't go back because I was brave. I went back because I'd watched a woman eat her own infant on a sidewalk in Aurora, Colorado, and the only locked door left in my mind was attached to a place I'd spent 2 years trying to forget. My name is Catherine Ellison. I'm 34. I was a procurement analyst for a hospital supply chain, which means I spent my professional life calculating how fast institutions run out of things. Gloves, sutures, saline, ventilator circuits. I can tell you the burn rate of any consumable in any facility within 6 hours of walking its inventory. It is not a dramatic skill. It does not make for good stories at dinner parties. But when the world starts subtracting, the person who counts what's disappearing becomes very useful, very fast. The outbreak had a name by the time I left Denver. They were calling it Harker syndrome on the news, after the first case cluster in Harker Heights, Texas. The Centers for Disease Control had issued a formal advisory 6 days earlier, but advisories mean nothing when the footage outpaces the language. I watched the first confirmed attack video on my phone while sitting in my car outside a Whole Foods. A man in a parking lot in El Paso, shirtless, barefoot, moving wrong. Not running, not walking. Something between. A mechanical lurch that looked like a body, operating on instructions it couldn't fully decode. He caught a woman loading groceries into her trunk. He bit through her forearm so fast that the person filming didn't even flinch for 2 full seconds. The sound she made lives in a frequency I will carry until I stop breathing. Denver was not safe. I knew this arithmetically before I knew it emotionally. My apartment complex had 900 units, 3 stairwells, 2 elevators, 1 underground garage with a single vehicle exit. I ran the numbers the same way I'd run burn rates on catheter kits. How many people, how many exits, how many minutes. The math said leave. The math always says leave when the denominator is a bottleneck. I packed in 40 minutes. Not survival supplies. I wasn't a survivalist. I packed documents, medications, my laptop, 3 changes of clothes, 4 cases of water from my pantry, and every non-perishable I owned, which amounted to embarrassingly little. I drove east on I-70 before the interstates locked. I know now that I missed the closures by less than 2 hours. That margin has become one of the many numbers I turn over at night like a coin I can't stop fingering. The route took me through Kansas, then Missouri, then a diagonal slide through West Virginia on roads I'd driven exactly once before, the first time Marcus brought me home to meet his family. I remembered the mountains. I remembered the specific green of the Shenandoah in late spring, how it looked like someone had oversaturated a photograph. I remembered his mother Colleen's face when Marcus introduced me, the way her smile didn't reach past her cheekbones. I remembered his brother Dale leaning against the porch rail, looking at me like I was a math problem he'd already solved. And I remembered the bunker. Marcus had shown it to me once, our second visit, in the giddy early phase, when he still thought sharing family secrets was romantic. His grandfather had built it in 1962, a government contract nobody talked about. I was driving toward people who hated me, but I was also driving toward the only sealed concrete I knew existed. The drive should have taken 11 hours. It took 31. I picked up the first passenger outside Topeka. Her name was Janelle. She was standing on the shoulder of I-70 beside a Honda Civic with both front tires blown, holding a toddler in one arm and waving with the other. The child was silent, not sleeping, just silent in the way children become when fear has been sustained long enough to become chemical. I stopped. I want to say I stopped because I'm good, But the truth is more mechanical than that. I stopped because her posture, one arm up, one arm cradling, looked exactly like the last image I'd seen on the news before I turned it off. A woman on a rooftop in Amarillo, holding her child above her head while the infected climbed. The resemblance was arbitrary, but my foot hit the brake before my brain finished the comparison. Janelle didn't speak for the first 40 minutes. She buckled the toddler. His name was Dion, I learned later, into the back seat, using a car seat she'd pulled from the Civic with one hand, and she sat beside him. When she finally talked, she told me her husband had turned. Not bitten by a stranger, not attacked in a crowd. He'd come home from his shift at a distribution warehouse in Lawrence, with a scratch on his forearm he said came from a shelf bracket. 12 hours later, he was standing in their kitchen, holding a knife he didn't remember picking up, staring at Dion's bedroom door, and sweating through his shirt so thoroughly it looked like he'd been swimming. She said she locked him in the bathroom. She said he hit the door for 4 hours. She said when the hitting stopped, the sound that replaced it was worse. I didn't ask what the sound was. I have learned that there are doors in other people's stories you do not open unless they hand you the key. The second passenger was a man named Glenn. 60s maybe, hard to tell. He was walking, actually walking, no car, no pack, along Route 50 in central Missouri. And I almost didn't stop, because a man alone on foot during a collapse is either a survivor or a predator, and you don't always get to know which before it matters. Janelle saw him first. She said stop. I said no. She said he's limping. I said that's not our problem. Dion made a sound from the back seat. Not a word, just a small vowel, and I pulled over. Children don't get a vote in survival decisions, but sometimes the sound they make is the deciding ballot anyway. Glenn had been a feed store manager in Sedalia. He'd left on foot because his truck had been commandeered at a roadblock. Not by military, by civilians with rifles who decided that controlling vehicle movement was their contribution to order. He told us this flatly, without outrage, the way you describe weather. He had a pocket knife, a water bottle, and diabetes he managed with insulin he no longer had. That detail entered my procurement brain and started a countdown I didn't share with anyone. By the time we crossed into West Virginia, we'd collected 2 more. A couple, Ray and Sonia, found huddled inside a rest stop bathroom off I-64, the door barricaded with a vending machine they'd somehow tipped. Ray was bleeding from a gash on his temple. Sonia was holding a fire extinguisher like a club. Neither was infected. I checked. By then, I'd learned the signs. The tremor in the hands, the slight arrhythmic twitch in the jaw, the eyes tracking a half-second behind voluntary movement, as if the body's operating system was being rewritten in real time. So I arrived at the Maddox family property in the Shenandoah Valley not alone, not as the solitary penitent crawling back to a husband she'd abandoned, but as the driver of a sedan, carrying 5 additional human beings, none of whom had been invited. I want you to understand, I did not plan this as a strategy. I did not collect people to justify my return, but I also cannot pretend I didn't know, somewhere in the accountant corridors of my brain, that arriving with dependents would make it harder for Colleen Maddox to turn me away. I was already calculating before I knocked. The Maddox property sat on 38 acres at the base of a hollow, where the ridge folded in on itself like a closed hand. I remembered the driveway, gravel, steep, curving through a stand of black walnut trees that made the entrance invisible from the county road. The trees were the same. The silence was not. The last time I'd driven this road, there'd been birdsong so loud Marcus had joked that his mother trained them to perform for guests. Now the only sound was gravel under my tires, and Dion whimpering in the back seat. I saw Dale first. He was standing at the top of the driveway with a deer rifle across his chest, positioned exactly the way a person stands when they've been standing there for hours and have decided that whatever comes up the hill next will be handled by the same 3-pound trigger pull regardless. He was 41, 4 years older than Marcus, built like a man who'd never needed a gym because gravity and firewood had done the work. His face, when he recognized me through the windshield, went through 4 expressions in about 2 seconds. Surprise, confusion, contempt, and then something colder that didn't have a name. I rolled down the window. The air smelled like wood smoke, and something faintly chemical I couldn't place. Catherine. He said my name, the way you'd say a word you'd looked up in a dictionary and found the definition insulting. I brought people. He looked past me into the car. Janelle holding Dion. Glenn in the front passenger seat, ashen and quiet. Ray and Sonia compressed into the rear. The hell you did. They need shelter, Dale. You need shelter. You showed up at my family's property with 5 strangers, and you want me to believe this is charity. I didn't answer that, because he wasn't wrong. And arguing with a correct accusation is just theater. Colleen appeared on the porch of the farmhouse, before Dale could say anything else. She was 63, lean in the way Appalachian women get, when decades of work strip the body to its functional minimum. Her hair was pulled back. Her expression was the one I remembered from every holiday dinner. Evaluative, calibrated, a face that was always measuring whether you deserved the portion you'd been served. Let her up, Dale. Mom, I said let her up. It was not warmth. I want to be clear about that. Colleen Maddox did not welcome me. She calculated me. She saw a car with 6 people and made a resource decision the same way I would have. More hands, more problems, but also more labor and more distributed risk. The Maddox family did not survive 4 generations in this valley by being sentimental. They survived by being arithmetic. Marcus was inside the farmhouse. I didn't see him immediately. I was unloading the car, directing Janelle toward the porch, helping Glenn navigate the steps. His limp was worse. When I heard the screen door, and turned, and there he was. He looked older, not aged exactly, but compressed. Like the 2 years since our divorce had been applied with pressure rather than time. His beard was longer than I'd ever seen it. His hands were dirty. He was holding a wrench, which meant he'd been working on something mechanical, which meant some part of this property was already being maintained with intent. Catherine, identical inflection to Dale's. Same word, same family cadence, but underneath it, something Dale's version didn't have. A question, not why are you here? Something more foundational. Something like, are you real? Or is this the version of collapse where I start seeing the people I lost? Marcus, you brought people. I brought people. He looked at them. Janelle was sitting on the porch step, Dion in her lap, both of them staring at the mountains, like the landscape itself was shelter. Glenn was leaning against the porch rail, eyes closed. Ray and Sonia were standing near the car, still holding each other, uncertain whether they'd been admitted or merely not yet expelled. How many more are coming? Marcus asked. I don't know. That's the wrong answer, Catherine. It's the only honest one. He set the wrench down on the porch railing. The sound it made was small and precise, like a period at the end of a sentence neither of us was ready to finish. The farmhouse had 4 bedrooms, a kitchen large enough to seat 12, and a basement that smelled like decades. Colleen had been running the property alone since Marcus's father, Earl, died of a stroke 3 years before the outbreak. Earl was the one who'd maintained the bunker. Earl was the one who'd kept the generators serviced, the water filtration system flushed, the ventilation shafts clear of debris and animal nesting. Without Earl, the bunker had become a theoretical asset. Everyone knew it was there. No one had gone down in over a year. Marcus told me this while we stood in the kitchen, the rest of the house filling with the awkward choreography of strangers learning to share a space no one had offered them. Janelle had taken Dion to the smallest bedroom. Glenn was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking water slowly, his color worse than it had been in the car. Ray and Sonia were on the back porch, talking in low voices that stopped whenever anyone came near. The bunker's intact, Marcus said, structurally. Dad built it to last a century, but the systems haven't been tested. Filtration, generator, water recycling, all of it's been sitting. Then we test it. He looked at me with an expression I recognized from our marriage. The face he made when I skipped the emotional preamble and went straight to the operational conclusion. It used to frustrate him. Now it seemed to relieve him, which told me more about his current state than any confession would have. Dale doesn't want your people here. They're not my people. You drove them here. That makes them yours. He was right, and I hated it. Procurement logic operates on a clean principle. You acquire what you need, you track what you have, You project what you'll consume. People are not inventory, but I'd treated them like cargo, loading them into my car along a supply route toward a destination I needed for myself. Janelle, Glenn, Ray, Sonia, Dion. They were in my ledger now whether I'd intended it or not. That afternoon, Marcus and I went down to the bunker together. The entrance was behind the barn, sealed with a steel door set into the hillside and covered by a wooden lean-to that looked, from the outside, like a collapsed storage shed. Earl's camouflage. The door required a combination lock and a physical key, both of which Colleen produced from a lockbox in her bedroom closet, with the resigned efficiency of a woman handing over something she'd hoped would never be needed. The air inside was stale, but not toxic. The concrete was cold and dry. The layout came back to me in fragments. Marcus had walked me through it 5 years ago, narrating with the boyish enthusiasm of a man showing his wife something he thought was impressive. I'd pretended to care. I'm not proud of that. I'd stood in this corridor and calculated how quickly I could get back to the farmhouse and check my email. Now I stood in the same corridor and calculated oxygen volume per person per hour. The main space was roughly 2,000 square feet, divided into 4 rooms, a central living area, 2 sleeping quarters, and a mechanical room housing the generator, filtration unit, and water system. There was a small bathroom with a composting toilet. Storage shelves along one wall held canned goods Earl had rotated religiously until the year he died. After that, nothing had been added or removed. "These cans are 3 years old," I said. "Some older. Expiration dates?" Dad didn't believe in them. He said canned food lasts until the can fails. I pulled one off the shelf. Green beans. The can was intact, no bulging, no rust. I set it back. My brain was already building the spreadsheet. Cans counted, caloric density estimated, consumption rate projected against head count. 6 people in the house. 7 if I included myself. 8 including Colleen. "There's enough here for maybe 30 days, I said. "If it's just us." Every additional person cuts that window. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that restructured the entire equation. "There are already more people coming. Dale's wife, his 2 kids. They were in Staunton. He's been on the radio trying to reach them." The math shifted. I felt it physically. The way a spreadsheet rebalances when you change one cell and the whole model moves. Dale's wife was named Teresa. His children were Parker, 12, and Lily, 9. They arrived the next morning in a pickup truck driven by a man none of us knew, a tow truck operator named Holt, who'd found them stranded on Route 250 when their own vehicle overheated. Holt was enormous, easily 6'4", with hands that made the steering wheel look like a toy, and he had the calm, undisturbed demeanor of a man who'd spent his professional life arriving at other people's emergencies. Dale met them at the top of the driveway. I watched from the kitchen window. He held Teresa for a long time, the rifle slung behind his back, his face buried in her hair. Parker stood beside them stiffly, performing the composure of a boy who'd decided this crisis required him to be older than he was. Lily clung to her mother's leg and didn't look at anyone. Holt stayed in the truck. He didn't get out. He didn't presume. He sat with his hands on the wheel and waited to be addressed, which told me he understood the social physics of arriving uninvited at a stranger's fortified property. Dale walked to the driver's window. I couldn't hear the exchange, but I watched Holt hand Dale a folded piece of paper and point south. Dale read it. His posture changed. He walked back to the house faster than he'd left. "What did he give you?" Marcus asked when Dale came through the door. Dale set the paper on the kitchen table. It was a hand-drawn map, crude but legible, showing road conditions between Staunton and Harrisonburg. Red lines for blocked routes. X marks for what Holt had labeled, in blunt pencil, as nests, concentrations. Places where the infected had gathered in numbers large enough to be territorial. "He says the valley's compressing," Dale said. "Infected are moving east from the lowlands. High ground's still clear, but the corridor is narrowing. He says in a week, maybe less, this road won't be drivable. Then we need to decide who's inside and close the door," Colleen said from the stove, where she was heating canned soup with the same procedural calm she'd used to make Christmas dinner. "There are 11 of us," I said. I'd been counting. Marcus, Dale, Colleen, Teresa, Parker, Lily, Janelle, Dion, Glenn, Ray, Sonia. Plus me. 12. 12, Marcus corrected, looking at me. You keep leaving yourself out of the count. I didn't respond to that. I'd been leaving myself out of counts my entire life. It was not a trait I intended to examine in the middle of an apocalypse. Holt makes 13, I said instead. Holt isn't staying, Dale said. He drove your family here, and I thanked him. That doesn't make him a resident. This was the first real fracture. Not a dramatic confrontation, nothing cinematic, no shouting. Just a sentence from Dale, delivered with the administrative finality of a man who believed property lines were moral boundaries, and the rest of us standing in the kitchen calculating whether to challenge it. Holt solved it himself. He came to the door, knocked once, and said he was heading south to find his sister in Roanoke. He asked for water and gas. Dale gave him both. Holt shook his hand, nodded to the rest of us, and drove away. I watched the truck disappear down the driveway and felt the specific guilt of relief. The ugly internal arithmetic of being glad someone else left so the numbers improved. I'd done this calculus in hospitals. I'd watched ICU bed counts and felt a version of this same quiet, shameful optimization when a patient was discharged or transferred. The math doesn't care about your feelings. It just updates. That night, Marcus found me on the back porch. The mountains were black against a sky that had more stars than I'd seen since the last time I'd stood in this exact spot during our marriage, pretending to admire a view I was already planning to leave behind. You're doing that thing, he said. What thing? Counting in your head. Your lips move. They always did. I stopped. He sat beside me, not close, not far. The exact distance of people who once shared a bed and now share only geometry. Glenn collapsed on the third morning. He'd been managing his diabetes with rationing, cutting his remaining insulin supply into fractions, extending each dose past its therapeutic window, trying to stretch a 3-day supply across what he knew would be weeks. He hadn't told anyone. I found him on the bathroom floor, conscious but gray, his blood sugar so low his hands were shaking in a pattern that looked, for one terrible second, like the early tremor of infection. Janelle screamed. She was in the hallway with Dion, and she saw Glenn on the floor, and she screamed, and the sound brought Dale from the barn with his rifle already raised, because in this new grammar, a person on the floor meant one specific thing, and the response to that thing was already programmed into the muscles of every survivor. He's not infected, I said, louder than I meant to. It's hypoglycemia. He's diabetic. He needs sugar. Now. Colleen was the one who moved first. She went to the pantry, came back with a jar of honey, and knelt beside Glenn with the competence of a woman who'd managed livestock her entire life and understood that a body in crisis needs intervention, not committee. She fed him honey from a spoon. Slowly, carefully. His color came back in increments, like watching a photograph develop. After he stabilized, I sat with him on the porch. He was embarrassed. The specific embarrassment of a man who'd spent 60 years solving his own problems and had just become a problem for other people to solve. How much insulin do you have left? I asked. 2 days. Maybe 3 if I keep cutting it. You can't keep cutting it. I know. There's a pharmacy in Elkton. 12 miles. We passed it on the way in. He looked at me with the expression of a man who understood exactly what I was suggesting and was calculating whether to let me suggest it or stop me before the idea became a plan. He chose silence, which was permission. I brought it to Marcus that night. Not Dale. Marcus. This was a deliberate choice. Dale would calculate the risk against the return and call it negative. Marcus would calculate the same numbers, but add one variable Dale never included. What it costs to watch someone die of something you could have prevented. 12 miles, Marcus repeated. There and back. 1 vehicle. 2 people. Through what? Holt's map shows the route clear as of 2 days ago. 2 days is a century now. I know. But Glenn dies without insulin. Not might die. Dies. It's pharmacological certainty. Marcus rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture so familiar it hurt. He'd done it every time I'd presented a household decision as an inevitable conclusion, rather than a discussion. The irritation in it, Used to make me defensive. Now it just made me wait. "I'll drive," he said. "Dale watches the property." "I'm going with you." "No, I know the supply chain. I know what to take and what's worthless. You'll grab the wrong things. It's a pharmacy, Catherine, not a warehouse. Every building is a warehouse now. The person who inventories it fastest survives. That's me. That has always been me." He didn't argue further. I think he recognized the specific frequency of my voice, the one that meant the decision was already made, and the conversation was just the sound of him catching up to it. He'd heard it when I told him I'd taken the job in Denver. He'd heard it when I told him I wanted a divorce. I was not proud that my most effective communication tool was the same instrument I'd used to dismantle our marriage. We left before dawn. Dale stood at the top of the driveway with his arms crossed and said nothing, which was louder than anything he could have articulated. Colleen handed me a paper bag with 2 sandwiches and a bottle of water, and for one disorienting second, the gesture felt maternal, and I had to look away before the feeling landed somewhere I couldn't afford it to land. The road into Elkton was empty, not abandoned empty, evacuated empty. Doors open, cars parked at angles, a silence so thorough it had texture. We drove slowly, windows up, scanning. 12 miles, 22 minutes, 1 errand. That was the plan. The plan lasted approximately 9 of those minutes. The pharmacy was a single-story brick building on Elkton's main street, wedged between a hardware store and a laundromat. Its front window was broken, not smashed inward by looters, but pushed outward from inside. The glass scattered across the sidewalk, in a pattern that told a story I didn't want to read. Something had exited through that window. Something that hadn't used the door. Marcus parked the truck across the street. We sat for 3 minutes, watching. This was protocol we'd developed without discussing it. A silent agreement that any building required observation before approach. The way divers watch the surface before entering water they can't see through. Nothing moved. The morning light was thin and gray. Somewhere to the south, I could hear a car alarm still cycling through its pattern, powered by a battery that didn't know the world had changed. "I go in, you watch the street," I said. "We go in together. If something happens inside, no one gets the truck home." If something happens inside, I'm not sitting in a truck. I looked at him. He looked back. There it was again, the immovable core of Marcus Maddox, the thing I'd spent 2 years of marriage trying to navigate around, instead of simply respecting. He didn't argue through logic. He argued through presence. He just existed in his position until the other person recalculated around him. We went in together. The pharmacy's interior was dim and ravaged, but not in the way I'd expected. The front retail section, candy, magazines, seasonal displays, was untouched. The damage was concentrated behind the pharmacist's counter, where the controlled substances were stored. Someone had been here, someone systematic. The narcotic shelves were stripped clean, with the precision of a person who knew exactly what had street value and what didn't. The antibiotics were gone. The steroids were gone, but the insulin was there, 3 shelves of it, undisturbed in the refrigeration unit that was no longer refrigerating. I checked the dates, checked the packaging integrity, grabbed every unit. 47 vials. At Glenn's dosage, roughly 4 months of life. "Take the syringes too," Marcus said. He was watching the back hallway, the one that led to the stockroom and the rear exit. His body was angled in the way I'd seen Dale's angled at the driveway, a posture that meant a human being had voluntarily converted himself into a barrier. I loaded syringes, alcohol swabs, glucose tablets, test strips. Then I kept going, not because of Glenn, because my brain was already in procurement mode, and once I enter that state, I cannot stop cataloging. Blood pressure cuffs, bandages, suture kits from the first aid section, antacids, ibuprofen, acetaminophen, nothing glamorous, everything essential. 2 bottles of prenatal vitamins, because Sonia had been nauseous every morning since she'd arrived and hadn't told anyone except me, and I hadn't told anyone including her that I'd noticed. I was loading the second bag when Marcus said my name in a voice I'd never heard before. Catherine. 1 word. No inflection. A sound stripped of everything except information. I turned. Through the broken front window, across the street, standing beside our truck, A man was staring at the pharmacy. He was shirtless, barefoot, and his left arm hung at an angle that meant the shoulder was dislocated, or the muscles controlling it had stopped receiving coherent instructions. His skin had a quality I can only describe as translucent. Not pale, but thinned, as if the tissue between surface and bone was being consumed from inside. He wasn't moving toward us. He was just standing. His head was tilted at a listening angle, like a dog tracking a frequency beyond human range. Marcus raised one hand slowly, not a greeting, a measurement, testing whether the motion would trigger pursuit. The infected man's eyes tracked the hand. Then they tracked past it, to me, standing behind the counter holding 2 bags of medical supplies. His jaw opened and closed twice, producing no sound, and then he turned and walked, not lurched, not ran, walked, down the center of the street toward the south end of town. We waited 4 minutes. Then we loaded the truck and drove without speaking. The insulin was cold against my lap the entire way home. Life, measured in vials, balanced on a woman's knees. We returned to the property to find that the population had increased by 3. A woman named Marguerite, her teenage son Aiden, and her mother, who everyone called B, and who was 78 years old with advanced macular degeneration that left her functionally blind. They'd come up the mountain on foot, following the road, moving slowly because B could not be rushed, and Aiden would not leave her behind. Marguerite had been a veterinary technician in Waynesboro. She carried a backpack with surgical tools designed for animals, and a calm, exhausted authority that reminded me of emergency room nurses I'd worked with, people who'd been trained to manage crisis in bodies that weren't always human, but were always suffering. Dale was furious. Not at Marguerite, at the math. 15 people now. The bunker's supplies, which I'd inventoried on my first day and tracked in a notebook I kept in my back pocket, were calculated for 8 people over 60 days. Every additional body compressed the timeline. 15 people meant roughly 32 days, assuming no spoilage, no theft, no dietary complications, no waste. "We can't keep doing this," Dale said. He was talking to Colleen, not to Marcus, not to me. He was talking to the only authority he recognized, his mother, the matriarch, the woman whose word was the closest thing this family had to law. Colleen was sitting at the kitchen table, shelling beans from the garden. She didn't look up. "Doing what, Dale?" "Collecting people. Every car that comes up the drive, every person on the road. We take them in, we feed them, we burn through what we have. Eventually the pantry's empty, and we're 15 people with nothing, instead of 8 people with something." "7, Colleen said. "What? Your original count was 7. You weren't including Catherine." The silence that followed was architectural. It held weight. Dale looked at his mother with the expression of a man who'd just been corrected on a detail he hadn't known was being tracked. "She's here, Dale. She brought people. More people came. That's what happens when you're visible. Your father knew that. It's why he built the bunker. Not to keep people out, but to have enough to let people in." I didn't know if that was true. I suspected Colleen was rewriting Earl's intentions to suit her current position, which is what matriarchs do. They narrate the dead into whatever shape serves the living. But the effect was immediate. Dale didn't argue further. He went to the barn and didn't come back until dinner. That night, I distributed the insulin to Glenn. He held the first vial with both hands, turning it in the light the way a jeweler examines a stone. He didn't thank me. He asked me something instead. "Why'd you stop for me? On the road, Missouri. You didn't want to." "No, but you stopped. Janelle told me to. Before that, you slowed down first. You were already deciding before she said anything." I didn't have an answer for that. Or I had one, but it implicated something about myself I wasn't ready to examine. The possibility that my procurement brain, the calculating machine I'd used to leave Marcus and optimize every relationship into a transaction, also operated in the other direction. That sometimes the spreadsheet says acquire, not divest. That sometimes the math points toward accumulation, even when the margin is negative. Glenn smiled. It was the first smile I'd seen on his face, and it made him look 20 years younger. And I looked away, because kindness from people you've nearly abandoned is a specific kind of wound. Marguerite found me afterward. She'd done a medical assessment of every person on the property, vital signs, visible conditions, risk factors, using veterinary instruments adapted for human physiology. She handed me a notebook page, blood pressures, resting heart rates, a column for concerns. Sonia's line had a small asterisk beside it. "She's pregnant," Marguerite said quietly. 8 weeks, maybe 9. She knows. She hasn't told Ray. The math shifted again. I felt the spreadsheet rebalance. A new row added. A new consumption curve plotted against a timeline that now extended past survival into something I hadn't calculated for, a future. The bunker became necessary on day 7, and the reason was not the infected. It was the living. A group of 4 men came up the driveway at midday, on foot, carrying rifles and wearing the loosely coordinated clothing of people who'd organized themselves after the collapse rather than before it. Their leader, or the one who spoke first, which in a crisis amounts to the same thing, was a man named Garrett, mid-30s, former construction foreman from Shenandoah, with a handshake that lasted 1 second too long, and eyes that inventoried our property while his mouth was making introductions. They wanted shelter. They said they'd been moving north through the valley, that the infected had overrun the lower elevations, that they'd lost people. The narrative was plausible. The delivery was polished. I didn't trust the disparity. Dale met them at the driveway with his rifle. Marcus stood behind him. Colleen watched from the porch. I stood in the kitchen doorway, counting their weapons, their supplies, their physical condition, the way Garrett's eyes moved to the barn, to the generator housing, to the garden, cataloging assets with a fluency that told me he'd done this before, not survival. Acquisition. "We're full," Dale said. "Full is a flexible number," Garrett replied. "Not here, it isn't." The negotiation lasted 20 minutes. It was civil. Garrett's men stood at parade rest, a formation that suggested military service or the imitation of it. They asked for water. Dale provided it. They asked to stay one night. Dale refused. They asked where else they could go. Dale said south. Garrett looked at the property one more time. The house, the barn, the garden, the hillside, and his gaze paused on the lean-to behind the barn. The camouflaged bunker entrance. He couldn't have known what it was, but his eyes stayed on it for 3 seconds longer than they stayed on anything else. And 3 seconds of focused attention from a man like Garrett was a surveyor's mark. They left. I watched them descend the driveway and turn south on the county road, and I waited until they were out of sight before I said what I was thinking. "They'll be back." Dale looked at me. It was the first time he'd looked at me without contempt since I'd arrived. The contempt was still there, but it was sharing space with something else. The reluctant acknowledgement that the woman who'd gutted his brother might also be the one reading the situation most accurately. "Why?" Marcus asked. Because Garrett counted everything. He saw the solar panels, the garden, the well housing. He calculated the property's carrying capacity, the same way I did when I arrived. He knows this place can sustain more people than we have. He'll come back with more men, and next time, it won't be a negotiation. "You don't know that," Marcus said. "I know procurement. I know what a man looks like when he's evaluating inventory for a hostile acquisition." The word hostile landed in the room and stayed there. That night, we began moving essential supplies to the bunker. Not all of them. We couldn't abandon the surface without signaling that there was something below it worth protecting. But the insulin, the medical supplies, half the food stores, water purification tablets, batteries, everything that a raiding party would take first. Marcus and I worked side by side in the bunker for 4 hours, organizing shelves, testing the generator, running the water system. The generator started on the 3rd pull. The water came out brown, then yellow, then clear. The air filtration hummed to life with a vibration I felt in my sternum. At one point, Marcus stopped and looked at me across the central room. "You're good at this." "At what?" "Preparing for the worst while standing in it. It's literally my job description. It's literally how you left me." The sentence sat between us. Neither accusation nor observation, just fact. I had prepared for the worst of our marriage while standing in it. I had inventoried the deficiencies, calculated the shortfall, projected the failure, and exited before the collapse. He was right. The skill that was saving us now was the same skill that had destroyed us then. I didn't defend myself. There was nothing to defend. I just kept stacking cans. Garrett came back on day 12, exactly as I'd predicted, with 9 men instead of 3. They arrived at dusk, which was strategic. Late enough that the failing light degraded our visual advantage. Early enough that they weren't navigating the driveway in darkness. They parked 2 trucks at the base of the hill and walked up, spread in a loose line that covered the width of the gravel road. Not military formation, but not casual either. Something practiced through repetition. The muscle memory of men who'd been approaching occupied properties for at least a week. Dale was at the driveway post. Marcus was at the house. Holt's map had noted a ridgeline trail behind the property, and Ray had positioned himself there with binoculars and the second rifle. We drilled this once, 2 days earlier, not because we were soldiers, but because Dale insisted and no one had a better idea. Garrett stopped 30 feet from Dale. His men stopped with him, a synchronization that confirmed they'd done this together before. Changed conditions, Garrett said. Valleys closing. Infected are moving upslope. The roads south are done. I've got 9 men with skills, weapons, and supply contributions. We're not asking for charity. We're proposing a merger. Dale didn't lower the rifle. There's no merger. This is private property. Private property is a concept that requires a government to enforce. I don't see a government. Do you? I was listening from inside the house, standing behind the closed front door with my hand on the deadbolt. Marguerite was behind me. She'd positioned the children, Parker, Lily, Dion, Aiden, in the basement of the farmhouse with Bea, Sonia, and Janelle. The bunker entrance was sealed. Only 4 of us knew the combination: Marcus, Dale, Colleen, and me. Colleen had given me the combination on day 5. She'd written it on a scrap of paper, handed it to me in the kitchen, and said, "If something happens to all 3 of us, someone needs to open that door." It was the most trust she had ever extended to me, and it arrived not as warmth but as contingency planning. Counteroffer, Garrett continued. We camp on the lower pasture, shared perimeter security, shared water access, separate food stores, 2 communities, 1 defensible position. It was reasonable. That was what made it dangerous. Reasonable proposals from armed strangers are the most sophisticated form of coercion because they make refusal look irrational. Marcus stepped onto the porch. He'd been listening from the kitchen window. How do we know you'll stay on the lower pasture? You don't. But you also don't know the infected won't reach this ridge by next week. Right now your perimeter is defended by 2 rifles and a prayer. I'm offering 9 bodies and 6 additional weapons. The math was correct. I hated that the math was correct. Every number Garrett cited was accurate. Our defensive capacity was insufficient. The infected were moving upslope, and 9 additional armed adults would transform our security architecture. The spreadsheet said yes. My procurement brain said yes. Everything I'd been trained to calculate said yes. But procurement operates on an assumption that the acquired asset remains under the acquirer's control. Garrett's men were not an asset I could inventory. They were a variable with independent will, superior numbers, and a leader whose eyes had already appraised every structure on this property, with the calm certainty of a man who'd decided what he wanted before he asked for permission. Marcus looked at me through the window. I shook my head. One small motion. The most consequential inventory decision of my life, communicated in a gesture that took less than a second. He turned back to Garrett. No, not the lower pasture, not the perimeter, not any of it. You need to leave. Garrett studied Marcus for a long time. Then he smiled. Not angry, not theatrical. Just the small, patient smile of a man revising a timeline. Okay, he said. We'll find somewhere else tonight. But the infected don't negotiate, Marcus. When they reach this ridge, you'll wish you had more rifles. He used Marcus's name. He'd remembered it from the first visit. That detail kept me awake for 2 nights afterward, turning it over like a stone with something written on the bottom I couldn't quite read. The infected reached the ridge on day 16. Not as a horde. The word implies coordination, intent, the Hollywood grammar of apocalypse. These were individuals, arriving separately, drawn uphill by some tropism I didn't understand. Maybe sound, maybe warmth, maybe the atmospheric gradient that pulls everything living toward higher ground when the lowlands become uninhabitable. The first one came through the tree line at dawn. Ray saw it from the ridgeline post, a woman, middle-aged, wearing a hospital gown that suggested she'd turned during treatment somewhere in the valley. She moved with the same mechanical fluency I'd seen in Elkton, not fast, not slow, but persistent, like a body executing a single remaining instruction with absolute commitment. She walked into the garden fence, pressed against it, and stood there for 6 hours. The second arrived that afternoon. A teenager, male, shirtless, with bite marks visible on both arms. He joined the woman at the fence. They didn't interact. They didn't communicate. They just stood, pressing forward with a force that was less than human strength but more than human patience. By nightfall, there were 7. By the next morning, 14. Marcus and Dale spent the day reinforcing the fence line. Ray and the newly arrived Holt, who had returned from his failed trip to Roanoke, having found his sister's house empty and the city impassable, worked the ridgeline perimeter. Marguerite inventoried our medical supplies. Colleen managed the house. Teresa managed the children. Janelle managed Dion, whose silence had become so absolute that Marguerite had begun monitoring him for signs of catatonic withdrawal. And I managed the bunker. This had become my role without anyone assigning it. I tracked the inventory. I maintained the generator schedule, 4 hours on, 8 hours off, to conserve fuel. I tested the water system daily. I kept a ledger that Glenn had started calling Catherine's Bible, which was a joke I didn't find funny, because the metaphor was too accurate. I was keeping scripture. I was recording the commandments of consumption, and every entry was a small prophecy about when we'd run out of something essential. Day 16's ledger entry read, 14, infected at perimeter, no breach, fuel reserves at 61%, water system nominal, food supply at 44 days for 15 people. Sonia's nausea worsening, Glenn stable on insulin, B's blood pressure elevated. Numbers, clean, honest, and completely inadequate to describe what it felt like to stand at the kitchen window and watch 14 bodies press against a wire fence with the blind persistence of water finding a crack. Marguerite joined me at the window. "They're degrading," she said. "What do you mean?" "Look at the first one. The woman. She arrived 12 hours ago. Look at her arms." I looked. The woman's skin had changed. What had been translucent was now visibly thinned, the subcutaneous tissue receding as if her body were consuming itself. Her movements, which had been steady that morning, were now intermittent. She'd press forward for a minute, then stop, then press again, each cycle weaker than the last. "I've seen this in animals," Marguerite said. "Certain parasites drive the host toward a transmission vector, a water source, a food source, other hosts. But the energy cost is unsustainable. The parasite burns through the host's metabolic reserves to fuel the compulsive behavior. Eventually, the host's systems collapse. How long? In animals? Depends on the parasite. Days, sometimes weeks. And in humans? I don't know. Nobody knows. But if the mechanism is similar, then every infected person out there is on a countdown. The question is whether the countdown expires before our fence does. I wrote it in the ledger, not as fact, as hypothesis. Marguerite's observation, dated, annotated, filed under a heading I labeled Biological Timeline. It was the first entry in my notebook that suggested survival might not require us to outlast the threat indefinitely. It suggested the threat might outlast itself. It was not comfort. It was arithmetic with an unknown variable. But unknown variables are better than infinite ones, and that night I slept for the first time in 4 hours without waking to count something. The secret broke on day 19, and it was not any of the secrets I'd been tracking. Sonia told Ray she was pregnant. She told him at dinner, in front of everyone, because, she explained later, when I asked her why she'd chosen a public venue for a private revelation, she needed witnesses. She needed the group to know, so that if something happened to her, the pregnancy wouldn't be an unrecorded fact. She'd learned from the outbreak that unrecorded facts vanish with the people who hold them. Ray's face went through a sequence I recognized from my own marriage. The rapid internal recalculation of every plan, every assumption, every projected future, collapsing and rebuilding around a single new data point. He didn't speak for nearly a minute. Then he put his hand on her stomach and said, "Okay." And the simplicity of that word carried more weight than any speech could have. But the pregnancy wasn't the secret that broke things. It was what came after. Colleen stood up from the table, set her napkin down with the precise fold she always used, and said, "There's something about the bunker you all need to know." Every conversation stopped. Dale's fork halted midway to his mouth. Marcus looked at his mother with an expression I'd never seen. Not surprise, but preemptive dread. The face of a man who knows what's coming and cannot prevent it. "Earl built that bunker in 1962, Colleen said. "Government contract. He was told it was standard civil defense. It wasn't. The specifications called for biological containment, sealed air, independent water, negative pressure capability. Earl didn't ask why. He built what they paid him to build. After the contract ended, the government never came back for it. Earl maintained it, because he was Earl, and Earl maintained everything." She paused. The kitchen was silent, except for Dion, making a small sound in Janelle's lap. 6 months before Earl died, a man from the Department of Defense came to this house. He asked Earl about the bunker. He asked about its condition, its capacity, its filtration specs. Earl told him everything. The man left. Earl never heard from him again. But Earl started upgrading the filtration system after that visit. He never told me why. I found the receipts after he died. Medical-grade HEPA filters, chemical scrubbers, equipment that had no civilian application. The room processed this in stages. Dale spoke first. "You're saying the government knew about a potential biological threat and used Dad's bunker as some kind of fallback site? I'm saying your father knew something was possible. I'm saying he upgraded the bunker to handle it. I'm saying I have watched every one of you treat that shelter like a lucky inheritance. And you need to understand, it was built for exactly this." I looked at Marcus. His jaw was tight, his hands flat on the table. He'd known. Not all of it, maybe, but enough. He'd known his father had upgraded the bunker beyond normal preparedness, and he hadn't shared it. "The filtration system," I said, "the one I've been maintaining, it's rated for biological agents?" Colleen nodded. "And you didn't tell us because knowing the shelter was designed for a biological event changes how people behave inside it. No, it makes them stay. It makes them stop thinking about the surface." Earl knew that. He said a shelter only works if the people inside it still believe in leaving. This was the moment I understood Colleen Maddox. Not as the cold matriarch who judged me insufficient for her son. Not as the pragmatic widow running a property alone. But as a woman who'd been carrying classified grief. The knowledge that her husband had spent his final years preparing for something terrible, and that his preparation had been proven right by the worst possible confirmation. She sat back down. She picked up her fork. She resumed eating, and the rest of us sat with the understanding that the bunker beneath our feet was not an accident, not a relic, not a curiosity. It was an answer to a question someone in a government office had asked decades ago, and the question had finally arrived. My ledger that night had no numbers, just one line. Earl knew. Day 22 brought Garrett back, and he didn't bring men. He brought bodies. 3 of them, loaded in the bed of a pickup truck, arranged with care that bordered on ceremony. His own people. I recognized one from the first visit, a young man who'd stood at the left end of the formation, with a shotgun held loosely, like he hadn't quite committed to the posture. Now he was dead, and not from infection. The wound was mechanical. Gunshot, center mass. Garrett himself was alone. No formation, no flanking line, no synchronized approach. He parked at the base of the driveway and walked up slowly, hands visible, no weapon. His shirt was torn. His face had the particular flatness of a man who has passed through something that removed the architecture holding his expressions in place. Dale met him. Marcus stood behind. I watched from the porch this time, no longer willing to observe from behind glass. "They turned on each other," Garrett said. 3 days ago. Fight over food allocation. Reese shot Thompson. Parker, not your Parker, a different one, shot Reese. Then it just kept going. I got out with 3 guys. Found 2 of them dead yesterday morning. Not infected, not shot. They just stopped. Walked into the valley and didn't come back. He looked up the driveway at the farmhouse, at the garden, at the fence line where infected still pressed with diminishing force. His eyes didn't inventory this time. They asked, "I'm not here to take anything. I'm asking to dig 3 graves on your property. Somewhere they won't be disturbed. Then I'll leave." Dale looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at me. The calculation was different now. This wasn't a man proposing a hostile merger. This was a man holding the receipts from one that had already failed, asking for a burial plot and nothing more. "Lower pasture," Colleen said from the porch. She'd appeared without anyone hearing the door. "East side, near the tree line. The soil's soft there. Garrett buried his people in 3 hours. He worked alone. Nobody offered to help, and he didn't ask." Marcus watched from a distance. Not guarding, not supervising, just witnessing. Because there are some labors that require a witness, even when the laborer doesn't request one. When he finished, Garrett came to the porch. Colleen gave him water and a plate of food. Canned chicken, rice, green beans from the garden. He ate with the mechanical efficiency of a man who understood calories as fuel rather than pleasure. "The valley's emptying," he said between bites. "Infected are dying. Not all of them. But the ones that turned earliest are collapsing, falling down in the roads, not getting back up." Marguerite stepped forward from the doorway. "Describe the collapse." Garrett looked at her. Then he described it with the precision of someone who'd watched it happen many times at close range. The skin thinning, the muscle wasting, the infected walking progressively shorter distances, stopping more frequently, eventually sitting or lying down, and simply ceasing to move. The timeline, he estimated, was roughly 3 weeks from turning to total metabolic failure. 3 weeks, Marguerite repeated. She pulled her notebook from her pocket and wrote the number beside the hypothesis she'd recorded on day 16. 2 data points. Not enough for certainty, enough for hope. Garrett finished eating. He stood, returned the plate to Colleen, and walked to his truck. At the base of the driveway, he stopped and turned back. "You were right to refuse me," he called up. "Both times. I would have taken this place from you. I want you to know that. Not because I'm honest now. Because the version of me that would have done it is dead with the rest of them. And the version standing here doesn't have the architecture for it anymore." He drove south. I never learned what happened to him. The story of Garrett ends at the base of a gravel driveway, with a confession delivered uphill, to people who were too far away to see his face clearly, but close enough to hear the specific sound of a man who had dismantled his own justification and had nothing left to stand on. The secret I carried was not about the bunker or the infected or the supplies. It was about Marcus. It was about our marriage. And it was the weapon I'd brought with me to the Shenandoah Valley, alongside 5 strangers and 47 vials of insulin. During our marriage, Marcus had an affair. Not physical, emotional, sustained, devastating in the specific way that an ongoing intimate conversation with someone outside the marriage can be. Her name was Renee. She worked at the county planning office. I found the messages 6 months before I took the Denver job. 312 messages over 4 months, each one a small excavation of the intimacy he'd stopped offering me. I never told him I knew. I used the discovery as fuel for a departure that was already in motion. It made leaving clean. It made leaving righteous. It converted my calculated exit from an act of self-serving optimization into an act of justified withdrawal, and I carried that justification like a card in my wallet for 2 years. The proof that I was not the villain of our story. What I never told anyone, not Marcus, not my therapist, not my sister, not any of the friends who listened to my careful, curated version of the divorce, was that I'd found the messages because I was looking for them. I'd been reading his phone for 2 months before Renee appeared, searching for evidence I could use. Not evidence of infidelity, evidence of insufficiency. Anything I could add to the spreadsheet that would make the final column total high enough to justify what I'd already decided. Marcus's affair didn't cause our divorce. I caused our divorce. The affair was just the number that balanced the equation. I carried this knowledge into the bunker. I carried it past Dale's contempt, past Colleen's arithmetic, past the infected at the fence line, past every moment of forced collaboration with a man I'd wronged more precisely than he'd ever wronged me, and I carried it as leverage. Because if the power dynamics inside this group ever shifted against me, if Dale convinced Colleen to expel me, if the family closed ranks and decided the ex-wife and her collected strays were expendable, I could detonate Marcus's affair in front of everyone and reposition myself as the injured party, the woman who'd been betrayed, the one who deserved shelter because she'd already been denied loyalty. This was my insurance policy, my procurement contingency, my worst self, folded neatly and stored in a pocket I checked every night to make sure it was still there. Day 24. The infected at the fence had dropped from 14 to 6. The ones that remained barely moved. Marguerite's timeline was holding. 3 weeks from turning to collapse, give or take. The earliest arrivals were already motionless, their bodies curled on the ground in positions that looked almost peaceful, like sleeping animals. The later arrivals still pressed against the fence, but weakly, with the diminished force of a mechanism running out of the energy that drove it. Inside the house, the group had settled into something resembling routine. Colleen managed meals. Dale managed perimeter. Marcus managed infrastructure. Marguerite managed health. Glenn, stabilized on insulin, had become the default caretaker for the children, reading to them from a collection of farmers' almanacs he'd found in Earl's study. Teresa taught Aiden mathematics at the kitchen table each morning. Janelle had begun to speak more, mostly to Sonia, mostly about the pregnancy. And I managed the ledger. I counted what we had and projected when we'd run out of it. I was the woman with the notebook, the accountant of survival, the person everyone needed and nobody trusted, which was, I realized, exactly how I'd functioned in my marriage. On the night of day 24, Marcus found me in the bunker, checking the generator fuel gauge. "You know about Renee," he said. I didn't react, not because I'd prepared for this moment, because the arithmetic of my concealment had always included the variable that he might figure it out, and the response I'd calculated for that variable was silence. "How long have you known?" "Since before I left." The generator hummed between us, measuring out its mechanical heartbeat. "I found the messages," I said. 312. I counted them. Marcus leaned against the bunker wall. His posture was not defensive. It was the posture of a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying up a long hill, finally reaching a flat place where he could stop. "I ended it before you left," he said. "I ended it, and I never told you it existed, because I thought if you didn't know, the damage would stay contained. It didn't." No, it didn't. We stood in the bunker's mechanical room, surrounded by Earl's engineering, the filtration system, the water recycler, the concrete walls that had been poured with a specific threat in mind. The generator measured time in rotations. We measured it in the silence between sentences. "I was going to use it," I said, "against you. I brought it here as insurance. If Dale tried to push me out, if your mother decided I was expendable, I was going to tell everyone. I was going to make you the reason I left, in front of your entire family, so they'd have to keep me." Marcus closed his eyes, not in pain, in recognition. He knew me. He had always known me, even the parts I'd built specifically to be unknowable. The procurement architecture, the spreadsheet logic, the calculating machine that optimized every relationship into a balance sheet. He'd married me knowing what I was, and he'd let me leave knowing I'd taken inventory of his failure and filed it for future use. "And now?" he asked. This was the moment, the turning point I hadn't anticipated, hadn't planned for, hadn't entered into any ledger. Because the answer was not the one my architecture had prepared. "I don't want to use it." He opened his eyes. "I don't want to use it," I repeated. "Not because it wouldn't work. It would. Dale would side with me. Your mother would recalculate. The whole power structure would shift. I'd be safe, protected, justified." "Then why?" I looked at the shelves I'd organized, the cans I'd counted, the generator I'd maintained, the water system I'd tested daily. I looked at the infrastructure of survival I'd built inside a structure Earl Maddox had poured from concrete 60 years ago, for a future he'd been told was coming. And I thought about Sonia's pregnancy, and Glenn's insulin, and Dion's silence, and Parker's forced maturity, and B's blindness, and every single person upstairs whose survival was connected to the integrity of the group. And I understood that my insurance policy was not a weapon, it was a detonator. And the building it would destroy was the one I was living in. Because these people need a functional group more than I need a strategic advantage. And using your affair to secure my position would fracture every relationship in this house, including the one where your mother started trusting me. Marcus was quiet for a long time. The generator cycled. The filtration system hummed. Somewhere above us, through layers of concrete and earth, Colleen was cooking dinner, and Dale was watching the fence line, and children were being read to from almanacs that predicted weather for years that no longer existed. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, "for Renee, for not telling you, for letting you leave without knowing the real geometry of what went wrong. I'm sorry for counting your messages instead of reading them, for looking for proof instead of asking a question, for building a case instead of having a conversation. We didn't touch. We didn't reconcile. We didn't perform the cinematic resolution that the moment seemed to demand. We stood in a bunker built for biological catastrophe and told each other the truth about the smaller catastrophe we'd engineered between us. And when we were done, the generator was still running, and the numbers in my ledger hadn't changed, and the infected outside were still dying on their own timeline. But something in my ledger's margin, the unquantifiable space where I'd been keeping the weight of my own worst calculation, went quiet. Not empty, not absolved, just quiet, the way a machine sounds when you remove the bearing that was grinding. Day 28. The last infected at the fence fell. I was in the garden when it happened. I'd been harvesting beans. Colleen had taught me, not gently, but thoroughly, the way she taught everything, with the expectation that you'd learn because the alternative was uselessness, and she didn't tolerate that. I heard the fence creak, looked up, and watched the final infected standing at our perimeter. A man, young, wearing a fast food uniform shirt that had become a grotesque memorial to the world's last normal Tuesday, fold at the knees and sink to the ground. He didn't fall dramatically. He subsided, like a structure whose last load-bearing member had finally given way. He settled onto the earth beside the others who'd already gone down, and he stopped, and the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of a mechanism completing its function. The parasite had finished consuming its hosts. Marguerite's timeline had held, roughly 3 weeks from turning to metabolic collapse. Nobody cheered. Dale walked the fence line and confirmed that all 14 bodies were motionless. Marcus checked the driveway and the tree line. Holt, who'd become our most reliable perimeter watchman, his size and calm making him a natural sentinel, reported no movement on the ridgeline. Marguerite examined the nearest body through the fence. She didn't cross the barrier. None of us were ready for that. Complete systemic failure, she said. Consistent with total metabolic exhaustion, the pathogen drove the host until there was nothing left to burn. "Are they dead?" Dale asked. "They're not functioning. Whether that constitutes dead in the traditional sense." Heart stopped. Brain activity ceased. "I can't confirm without equipment I don't have." "Good enough," Dale said, and walked back to the barn. But it wasn't good enough, and we all knew it. The absence of visible threat is not the same as safety. The valley was still unknown. The roads were still unverified. The radio, a battery-powered AM unit that Colleen kept on the kitchen counter, had been cycling through static for 2 weeks, occasionally catching fragments of broadcast that suggested organized survival zones to the north, but never with enough clarity to constitute actionable intelligence. I updated the ledger. Infected at perimeter, 0 active. Food supply, 29 days at current consumption. Fuel, 41%. Water, stable. Medical, adequate. Insulin reserve at 62 days. Personnel health, stable, with the exception of Sonia's pregnancy advancing into the first trimester, with persistent nausea that Marguerite was managing with ginger root from Colleen's herb garden. The numbers told one story. The faces at dinner told another. Parker, who'd been rigid with performed adulthood since his arrival, had begun to soften. Lily had talked him into a card game with Aiden, and I'd heard him laugh for the first time, a sound so ordinary and so alien that Teresa had stopped mid-sentence in the kitchen and closed her eyes. Glenn was teaching Dion to whittle, not speaking. Dion still hadn't spoken a full sentence since I'd picked him up in Kansas. But Glenn sat with him on the porch every afternoon, shaping small wooden animals with his pocket knife, handing Dion a stick and a butter knife, and showing him the angle. The boy produced crude shapes that Glenn praised with gentle specificity. That's a good ear. That's a strong leg. Whether Dion heard praise or just sound, I couldn't tell. But he kept showing up on the porch, and he kept carving, and sometimes his mouth moved in the shape of words he wasn't yet ready to release. Janelle watched from the kitchen window. She watched her son engage with a diabetic stranger through an art form neither of them had practiced before, and her face held an expression I recognized because I'd been wearing a version of it since the day I arrived, the bewildered arithmetic of gratitude for something you never calculated for. That night, Colleen found me in the bunker doing my evening inventory check. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching me count. "You can stop counting now, Catherine." "Not yet." "When?" "When the number I need to calculate is growth instead of depletion." She considered this. Then she nodded, once, and left. It was the closest thing to approval she'd ever given me. Day 31. Marcus opened the gate. Not metaphorically. He physically unlatched the main gate at the top of the driveway, swung it wide, and walked down the gravel road to the county blacktop for the first time since the outbreak began. Dale watched from the porch with his rifle. I watched from the garden. Colleen watched from the kitchen window. We were all watching because opening a gate is easy, and what lies beyond it is not. He walked for 20 minutes and came back with information. The county road was clear in both directions. 3 abandoned vehicles, doors open, no occupants. 1 collapsed infected, weeks dead, fully desiccated, in the ditch near the intersection. No sound of movement, no sign of active threat, and a silence that Marcus described as different from the dangerous kind. "How is silence different?" Dale asked. "The dangerous kind is missing something. This kind isn't missing anything. It's just empty." I understood what he meant, even though it didn't parse logically. The silence of threat is the silence of subtraction. Something should be there and isn't. The silence of aftermath is the silence of completion. Nothing should be there, and nothing is. The grammar is identical. The feeling is not. Over the next 3 days, we expanded. Ray and Holt drove to Elkton and found it abandoned but intact. The pharmacy had been further raided, but still held useful supplies. The hardware store was untouched. Whoever had looted the town had prioritized pharmaceuticals and food, leaving behind the tools that would actually matter for long-term survival. Ray loaded the truck with hand tools, fasteners, wire, PVC piping, and a manual water pump that Holt identified as compatible with our well housing. Marguerite and I drove south to the nearest medical facility, a small clinic in a town called Stanley. It was empty. The examination rooms were disordered but not destroyed. I inventoried methodically: blood pressure cuffs, stethoscopes, basic surgical instruments, antibiotics that had been locked in a cabinet Marguerite opened with a knowledge of pharmaceutical storage that transcended her veterinary credentials. We found prenatal vitamins, folic acid supplements, and an intact portable ultrasound unit with a battery that still held charge. Sonia cried when Marguerite showed her the ultrasound image 3 days later. A blurred gray comma on a small screen, pulsing with a heartbeat that the machine translated into sound. Rapid, insistent, absurdly alive in a world that had spent a month dying. Ray stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder, and the room was silent except for that heartbeat, and I recorded the moment in my ledger not as a number, but as a date. The first entry that pointed forward instead of backward. The group had changed, not through any single event, but through the accumulated weight of shared survival, reshaping the boundaries between strangers. Janelle and Teresa had developed a partnership in the kitchen that ran on efficiency, and a humor so dry, it took me a week to recognize it as humor. Glenn and Aiden had formed an unlikely pair, The elderly diabetic and the teenage boy, connected by a shared comfort with silence and a mutual interest in B, whose blindness required daily navigation assistance that both of them provided without being asked. Dale still didn't like me. I don't think he ever would, but his dislike had shifted from the active contempt of a brother defending his sibling to the passive irritation of a man who recognized competence he hadn't expected and was annoyed at having to revise his assessment. He started consulting my ledger before making resource decisions. He never said thank you. He never acknowledged the consultation. He just adjusted his plans in alignment with my numbers, and I accepted this as the Maddox dialect for trust. On day 34, I found Marcus on the back porch, looking at the mountains. The green was still oversaturated. The birds had returned, tentatively, as if auditioning for the right to exist in the new silence. "I want to rebuild the front garden," he said. "Bigger. Enough to feed more people. How many more? However many come." The spreadsheet in my head started calculating. Then it stopped. Not because the numbers were impossible, but because, for the first time, the calculation I needed wasn't about depletion. Colleen died on day 39. Not from infection, not from violence, not from any threat the bunker had been built to withstand. She died from a pulmonary embolism that arrived without warning at 4 in the morning, a blood clot that traveled from her leg to her lung with the efficient brutality of a system failure in a body that had been operating under stress for longer than anyone had measured. Marguerite was with her within minutes. There was nothing to be done. The clot was massive, the damage immediate, and even in a fully equipped hospital, the outcome would have been uncertain. In a farmhouse in the Shenandoah Valley, it was simply the last number in a column Colleen had been carrying her entire life. Dale found her. He was the first one down the hallway, and the sound he made, not a word, not a shout, but a low, resonant sound from somewhere in his body that had never been asked to produce it before, brought the rest of us running. Marcus arrived second. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at his mother's body. He looked at Dale, kneeling beside the bed, with his hands around hers. He looked at the ceiling, and then at the floor, and then at nothing. I stood in the hallway and did not enter the room. This was family grief, and I was not family. I had divorced my way out of this constellation 2 years earlier, and no amount of shared crisis, shared bunker, shared survival arithmetic earned me passage into the geometry of a son losing his mother. I understood this with a clarity that hurt. Teresa went to Dale. Janelle took the children downstairs. Glenn sat in the kitchen with his hands flat on the table, staring at the grain of the wood with the focused intensity of a man anchoring himself to physical reality. Holt stood on the porch, looking outward, guarding nothing except the group's perimeter of grief. Marcus came to find me an hour later. He was holding a piece of paper, the combination to the bunker, written in Colleen's hand, the same scrap she'd given me on day 5. "She told me she gave you this," he said. "She did. She told me she trusted you with it because you count everything, and people who count everything don't waste what they're guarding." I took the paper. Her handwriting was small, precise, the penmanship of a woman who'd been educated in an era when letter formation was treated as a moral discipline. "She also told me," Marcus continued, "that you were the best thing that happened to this family during the outbreak, and the worst thing that happened to her son before it." I absorbed both halves of that sentence. They were both true. They had always both been true. Colleen Maddox had seen me completely, the calculating machine and the person inside it, and had judged both with the same unsparing accuracy she applied to everything. We buried her beside Earl, in the family plot at the top of the ridge, under a dogwood tree she'd planted the year Marcus was born. Dale dug the grave. Marcus and Holt lowered her. Glenn said a prayer that he qualified, afterward, as something he remembered from a church he hadn't attended in 30 years, and wasn't sure he believed in, but felt was owed. Bea, who couldn't see the grave, stood at its edge with her hand on Aiden's shoulder and said nothing, but her presence was enough, because sometimes witness is the only eulogy that matters. I stood at the back of the group. My ledger was in my pocket. I reached for it, the reflex to record, to quantify, to convert experience into data. And then I stopped. I left it in my pocket. Some things are not inventory. Some losses cannot be entered into a column and balanced against a projection. Colleen Maddox was not a number. She was the architect of the trust that held this group together, and her absence would be measured not in calories or fuel percentages, but in the specific silence at the kitchen table where she'd sat every morning, shelling beans, evaluating everything, counting the way I counted, but calling it something gentler. I keep the ledger. I will always keep the ledger, but the columns have changed. The first pages are depletion, what we had, what we consumed, what we lost. Those numbers are fixed now, historical, the accounting of a crisis that metabolized itself and left us standing in its residue. The later pages are different, planting schedules, rainfall measurements, growth projections for a garden that Marcus expanded to 3 times its original size, a birth estimate for Sonia's baby, due in early winter, annotated with Marguerite's medical notes in handwriting more elegant than mine. Dion spoke his first full sentence on day 44. He said, "Glenn, the ear is crooked." Janelle dropped a glass. Nobody mentioned it. Dale still doesn't like me. I've stopped requiring him to. Marcus and I are not together. We are not apart. We are something the language doesn't have a clean word for. 2 people who destroyed a marriage and built a commons, who failed at the intimate scale and functioned at the collective one. I don't know what to call that. The ledger doesn't have a column for it. Colleen's combination is still in my pocket. The ink is fading. I've memorized the numbers. I count them sometimes, late at night, the way other people pray.